On our last lecture of this series this semester, the subject today is populism in Europe. We talked just briefly about that last week. I said populism and perhaps the rise of the right were kind of synonymous. And your boss told me that, well, no, there's populism from the left and the right. So we'll see how that works out today. I'd like to introduce now Carla Ruffer, who is the person who really put this program together in the Center for European Studies. We appreciate her efforts very much, and she's going to introduce our speaker for today. Carla.
Thank you so much. It's nice to see everyone again. And thank you for letting us present this series this semester. It's been very interesting, and I hope you've liked it as well. We always enjoy coming here. So I'd like to introduce Michael Webb. He is a PhD candidate in the UF Political Science Department, and his research focuses on what he's speaking on today, which are the trends of populism, specifically in Europe. So we have lots of expertise here to learn about that today. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's really nice to be here. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about populism in Europe. I think this might also have been labeled Crises in Europe today. Where are they now? And so the good thing is that populists are crisis actors and sort of try to take advantage of the problems that exist. And so I'll actually kind of be talking about the crises that help to shape populist movements in Europe, to give us a better sense of who the populists are, in the sense that they're sort of born out of these moments of problems. Okay, so this map is a little bit darker on the PowerPoint slide, but you can probably see that specifically in what is, I guess, effectively the outline of Eastern Europe, you have these really dark districts. And these are spaces where populist parties have done really well. So that's Poland and Hungary. But you can also see that populist movements are present in Germany, France, Austria. And you'd actually see them in other spaces too, I think, if the lighter colors were more discernible, but they're not. And so this is a phenomenon that sort of has come to all of Europe at largely the same time. And there have been populist parties in Europe for a long time. I think the people who study it sort of say the 90s or so would be the sort of period where they start to really emerge, and that's in reaction to the sort of formalization of the European project, which is the European Union. But it's really in the last 10 years that they've started to see tremendous political success. Hungary, for example, has had a populist party, Fidesz, in power for the better part of 10 years now. And the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, has actually effectively tried to undercut democratic controls in that country, and has done so effectively to the point where it's sort of, as a country now, often seen as a competitive authoritarian regime instead of a democratic regime. And so populists are a real threat to democracy in Europe. And for that reason, there's something that we would want to be concerned about. But the real question that everybody is still trying to answer is, where did they come from? And why are they here? And so there are populists of the left and the right. Of course, left-wing populism is much more prevalent in Latin America than it is in Europe. European populism has tended to be right-wing, has tended to be oriented around culture. It's a little bit different from right-wing populism in the United States, because right-wing populism in the United States has tended to attach itself to the Republican Party, which has meant small government, or at least a sort of nominal commitment to small government. Whereas right-wing populism in Europe has tended to be much more culturally oriented. And along with that cultural orientation has come a focus on the welfare state because that's part of, at least in the European context, the maintenance of European culture. Retaining a European society that is sort of committed to the values that matter to Europe, and part of that is the welfare state. And so those are some of the distinctions that I would draw between European populism and populism in Latin America and North America. Okay, so this is the Italian Prime Minister, whose name has now left my mind, which is not a very good place to be, but she's recently elected. Okay, perfect. She's the leader of the Fratelli d'Italia, which is the northern party in Italy, the northern populist party in Italy. If we're talking about populism in Italy, it's important to remember that Italy itself is really culturally divided between the north and the south. The north is highly developed. It sort of sees itself as part of the northern European tradition, with more in common with Switzerland, Austria, and Germany than with the southern part of Italy. So these are the northern Europeans. And as you can see, there's this little lady whose name, again, I can't remember. Thank you. There we go. Giorgia Meloni. Yeah. Sono Giorgia. Yeah. She was actually part of a sort of proto-fascist youth group before eventually working in the Berlusconi government, becoming one of the youngest ministers in that government, and now actually heading the Fratelli d'Italia. So her connections to this sort of very, very conservative groups, even though she's sort of nominally less conservative than she was back in the day, have a lot of Europeans concerned because Italy, of course, is a very large country in the European Union. They play a major role in sort of keeping the European project on track. And so if the leaders of Italy are more interested in fostering national identity, in focusing on themselves as a country and not concerning themselves with sort of helping to bolster the European project, that could potentially be bad. And of course, as we've seen with Brexit, the countries that do that, it generally doesn't work well for. And so it's also a little bit problematic in that sense, because if the Fratelli d'Italia decided that they wanted to move in a sort of subversive direction in relation to the European project, it could actually be bad for the economy of Italy, as well as the economy of the rest of Europe. This is Viktor Orban, the leader of Fidesz, who I just mentioned. And as you can see, he doesn't think that liberal democratic government can remain competitive. And he's taken steps to remove liberal democratic government in Hungary. I think we've seen with the sort of the Ukraine war, or the war in the Ukraine, that the connections between Viktor Orban and Russia are in fact very, very strong. And that would be true generally, I think, of populist movements throughout Europe. And I don't know that that necessarily means that there's some nefarious connection between these parties and Russia, although there may be. I have no evidence either way. What we can say is that Russia is probably one of the last European nation states that sort of retains a desire for empire. I think you can see in Putin this sort of a pseudo-czar character. It's also one of the last nation states that has sort of been precluded from the European project. It's not been invited. But if you think back to World War II and the sort of major actors in that period, Russia was there. They were on the European stage. And so all of the populist leaders who are interested in sort of returning to a national identity look to Russia as a country that still has that, right? And so they can sort of point to Russia, and moving away from a supranational European organization towards a more intergovernmental, which is to say a collection of nations who remain distinct but working together, and sort of see that connection as being particularly valuable. So this is Marine Le Pen. She was the leader of the Rassemblement National, which is one of the sort of the French populist party. And it's a party that has been sort of dominant in rural spaces. So I think we can see in the National Rally, which is the sort of the English version of the name, a hint at what one of the possible causes of discontent for right-wing populism is, which is the sort of growing difference between the countryside, especially in France, and cities, right? So if you think about the city in Paris, the main one, or the city in France is Paris, right? It's Paris, it's the greater Paris metropolitan region, it's the Ile-de-France, which is the sort of actual county that Paris sits in. And there's a huge amount of wealth, a huge amount of human capital that's been pouring into that space. At the same time, housing prices in the Ile-de-France have gone way, way up to the point now that individuals who wanted to move there, who wanted to pursue the economic opportunities that are being developed in those spaces, are no longer able to do so. And so you have this sort of two dynamics in play, right? On the one hand, you have a great effort on the part of the state to take advantage of what are referred to as economies of scale, which come as a consequence of agglomeration. And agglomeration refers to sort of pushing all of your capital, whether it's human or literal physical capital, into a single space so that everybody can sort of take advantage of it together, and you get more growth that way. And then at the same time, the rural spaces becoming increasingly economically deprived, not only because of that concentration, but also because there are forces at work in society which are sort of aiming to move society forward technologically. We think about the sort of the robotic workforces that have sprung up in the last 30 or 40 years. Those are great in the sense that robots will work all night, but for those parts of every country in the world that used to sort of derive its competitive advantage from the fact that its labor was cheaper and that its land was cheaper. So if you needed to build a factory and you needed people to work in that factory, it was better to go in the United States, for example, to Syracuse, New York, than it was to try and build something in Manhattan. And now that's not the case, right? The land is still very expensive in Manhattan, but you could move somewhere else, set up your factory, and you wouldn't have to pay anybody. You could just sort of set up some robots in there. And that has serious negative repercussions for the communities that exist around those spaces. And that same thing is happening in Europe. So we see that in France, we see it in Germany, and I'll get into that a little bit more as we move forward. Okay, so what is populism? This is a big question in the political science literature. There are probably, as many definitions of populism as there are authors writing about populism. So this is my particular definition. But I draw on scholars who tend to focus on populism from a structural perspective and tend to focus on the real representative failures which emerge in modern democracies. And so that's something that I'm going to be talking about today, and sort of where some of those representative failures potentially come from, and what can be done about it. Like I said, populism is, or maybe I didn't say this, populism is a political reaction to representative failures to democracy. And with that comes this sort of statement that the people are not being served, right? Somehow the government is letting down the will of the people. And so, of course, the question that springs from that statement is, well, who are the people? And so that kind of becomes the focus with populist parties, right? Defining the people, defining a narrative of in-group and out-group in relation to representation and government efficacy. And in Europe, when it comes to the people, that has generally meant the sort of the keepers of the original culture, a culture which is being challenged in a number of respects right now in Europe, challenges which are both long-term and short-term. This leads to a particular character for populists, right? Like I said, they tend to be focused on national culture, on celebrating being Italian, on celebrating being French, on celebrating being German. The German AfD is all about the Leitkultur, right? They are very hostile to, or generally are very hostile to, both immigrants, generally, and also specifically the refugees which came in, I think it was something like 1.5 million to Europe during the Syrian refugee crisis. And they still get hundreds of thousands of asylum applications from these spaces. Europe has basically just sort of started to push back on them a little bit and not accept them because obviously it was having a pretty destabilizing effect on the politics of the countries. The one I sort of already mentioned this. Viktor Orban is the only populist politician who has really effectively undercut democracy in Europe. But that isn't to say that other populist politicians are not also attempting to undercut democracy. And it's also the case that many of them are actively doing so in the sense that they spread misinformation. And to the extent that trying to campaign with misinformation, misleading voters, is a form of undercutting democracy, then I think you could say that they're all somewhat guilty of it. Yeah, okay. So these are the 4 things that I'm going to talk about in relation to what is driving populism. The first is the actual European Union itself. I'm very much a fan of the European Union, so I'll put my biases on the table. But it has had effects on the sovereignty of states, and it has sort of led to some pretty significant tensions between the different regions as a function of the relative development of those spaces and as a function of the sort of capacity of those spaces to sort of guarantee the quality of life for their own citizens. At the same time, we have the refugee crisis, of course. We're going to have to talk about that. COVID-19 has had an effect. I think I'm just going to sort of talk about this after we hit the refugee crisis. It's a little bit of a convoluted development in the sense that different parties are playing different roles in the system. And as a consequence of that, some of them are helped by the COVID crisis, some of them are hurt by it, and it really just depends on their relative position in the system. It's not the kind of structural shock that all populist parties can take advantage of equally. And then finally, and this is my favorite topic, is Europe's economic periphery, which is declining, like I just mentioned. I'm not happy it's declining, but it's the thing that I focus on. And that creates discontent in many spaces. So, without further ado, I don't know how familiar everyone is with the European Union, but it's a supranational organization which brings to the table all of the member states in Europe to sort of collectively construct laws around key issues. And these are just the 5 that are very specifically the sort of the focus of Europe, and only Europe is allowed to construct laws on these issues. So customs, competition rules, basically the things that relate very specifically to the single market. And the single market, for those of you who don't know, is the sort of economic community in Europe at large, which basically says that all individuals in this space are allowed to trade with one another as if they were living in the same country. So it's a little bit like the way Connecticut and Rhode Island might trade with each other, or Florida and Georgia. It's the same kind of thing. That's what's at work in Europe, and that's what's been being constructed over the last 30 years or so. And so in the United States, it happened a long time ago. And so we've sort of equilibrated a little bit. In Europe, it's still ongoing. And consequently, there are individuals who remember what it was like before. And so they can sort of think back to that and say, well, wasn't it better when it was like that? I mean, I sort of miss the times when, you know, we had the good German products or we had the good Austrian products, and we didn't have to buy these other things which are being made cheaply in other countries. So that I think has an effect on how individuals living in these spaces think about their own national identity. And it's certainly something that is brought up time and again by populist actors, the extent to which the EU has effectively undercut the capacity of the countries that are members of the EU to effectively self-determine, right? And this is especially true in moments of crisis. So we think about the Euro crisis, we could think about the refugee crisis. All of those moments, the Europeans have to come to the table to react to it together, which is, of course, a good thing if you think about it in relation to what the alternative would be. And we've sort of seen what the alternative in Europe was for 200 years of sort of war between the nation states. But that doesn't mean that the people who live in those countries don't sort of resent the fact that they now have to hand over some of their own sovereignty. And so you can see that this has led to this sort of like resentment over a loss of sovereignty has led to the creation of Eurosceptic parties, which are often populist parties. The two are almost any radical right populist party in Europe is going to be Eurosceptic as well. There are very few of them that say, hey, I want a national identity, and also I love the idea of being in a supranational organization that sort of supersedes my national identity. The two are not really compatible. So this map, to sort of help you guys interpret it, the green spaces are places that are not supporting hard Eurosceptic parties. So these are parties that basically say, like, we need to cut back the European Union as much as possible. I'd leave it if I could. I'm not sure what needs to be done. And so you can see in France, in rural spaces, it's very popular. In the north of Italy, it's very popular. And one of the reasons why it's very popular in the north of Italy is because of the Euro crisis, which I mentioned on the last slide. And this was basically a period where the insolvency of Southern European countries, so Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, became a problem in international financial markets to the extent that lenders went to the Northern European countries and said, what are you going to do about these individuals who are blowing up your currency in the South? And that created a sort of led to a recession through a series of factors, but also led to the construction of a sort of commission committee, which then effectively limited the capacity of Southern European states to spend on their social state, right? So austerity measures were passed on all of these Southern states, and we saw the first real sort of implications of the European Union from the perspective of these states' capacity to self-determine being challenged. And that has led now to, of course, some of the states remain relatively pro-EU, but this is because left-wing populism is far more successful in Spain and Greece. But in Italy, you can see a sort of strong Eurosceptic contingent, which comes from northern Italy, which was less responsible for the Euro crisis than its southern counterpart. So I think the EU is a good place to start because when we talk about populism, because it's a permanent change in a sense, right? The decision to join the EU came with the construction of a single market, which has meant that countries and individuals in those countries have invested in other countries in such a way that everybody is so sort of mixed together financially now, and in terms of the sort of chain of production. Like, for example, with Brexit, if the UK had cut off trade with Europe, it would have run out of health supplies. I don't know if Amy Krappel shared this, but they would have run out of health supplies in like 6 days or something like that. The hospitals would have shut down. So it's really not feasible anymore for the single market to break off. And even if it was, it would take a very long time. And I imagine the pains of it would just lead to democratic government then pushing back and saying, okay, we're going to stay in the EU, right? There's just so much pain you can subject a country to before they push back and say, no, this is just how it is now. And so from that perspective, we can say that the EU is a permanent change. But what does that mean for the individuals who did not want the EU in the first place? Or now they live in a world where the EU is a reality and they just have to come to terms with it. And what can democracies actually do about that? Because effective democracy is predicated upon effective governance, right? If you're voting, but neither candidate can actually do anything about the problems that you're concerned with, then what are you voting for? What's the point of it? And so I think this is sort of, from the European Union, is a really interesting problem to study from that perspective, because it raises that question, right? And I think the answer is there's not really anything that democracy can do in reaction to that, except try to ease the negative externalities of the permanent change that's occurred, right? And so in the context of the European Union, maybe that's being sensitive to national identities. But the reality is that there's going to be a whole host of individuals who weren't particularly keen on the European Union from the start, who now have to live with the European Union, which is itself an institution of momentum, right? In the sense that the whole construct of the European Union was predicated on the idea that if we mix the single market together, then eventually that will spill over into other regions. And the sort of the competencies of the EU will increase and increase until we're effectively sort of united in the way that the United States are united, which is a good thing from the perspective of stopping war in Europe. But if you're a person who actually was pro your own particular national identity and having self-determination, and you don't like the Germans very much, or you don't like the Italians very much, and you want to be a French person in France doing French things under French laws, that's not something that's not a possibility anymore. That's not going to happen. And so that's something that people are struggling to come to terms with. And then if we think about the impact that the European Union has had in terms of the construction of the single market and what free trade and sort of the advance of liberalization has done to the economies of these countries and the effect that that is having on communities, this has sort of pretty significant implications. You can see how the sort of cultural elements, particularly in rural spaces, begin to blend with the economic elements, and you can see why populist parties are succeeding. And so from the perspective of populist parties, where are they today? The EU is not going anywhere, and so this is going to remain a specific issue in the context of European populism. The EU itself is going to, I think, as long as national identity is an issue, and as long as there's a pushback, a desire for the construction of a European identity which supersedes national identity, this will always be a tension in European politics, and there will always be space for European populists. The next thing we're going to talk about is the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis starts in, well, I guess you can see the chart down here. Beginning in 2008, it starts to pick up, but it sort of runs right through into 2016. It's cresting in 2015, 2016. I think Germany alone receives almost 1 million applications for asylum in 2015, and they accept a lot of them. They sort of make an effort to be a country that stands by its principles in that respect. They said they're going to be a place for refugees, and they try to do that. And this, of course, has a profoundly destabilizing effect on German society, because the Germans, being very bureaucratic, decided that the best way to distribute the refugees throughout Germany was to use the same algorithm that they use, or the same formula that they use to determine tax obligations, which is population density and sort of GDP output from the different spaces. And so cities all over Germany began to receive large numbers of immigrants, even cities that really hadn't had significant immigrant populations beforehand. And so this serves as sort of major shock, especially to communities in rural East Germany, because they still have cities out there. But those cities are they're more provincial in a sense. And so they go from being very isolated communities to being communities that are actually asked to make a really significant jump in terms of their capacity to integrate individuals who are really quite culturally different from them. I think here in the United States, it's something that we've become more used to because it's just, we are a country that sort of celebrates immigrants. While in Europe, it's not really something they've had to deal with. Many of these communities were almost, 100% homogeneously German. And you can think about that in Hungary as well, and Poland. I mean, Hungary, the reason Viktor Orban has been so successful is because of the impact of the refugee crisis and the fact that Hungary was one of the gateways into the rest of Europe. The same can be said for much of Southern Europe. So Italy and Greece, one of the reasons why these spaces have populist parties, why they have resistance, is because they're the sort of front line of the refugee crisis. And so when we talk about populism in Europe, we can't not talk about the refugee crisis, because in Germany, for example, which is Europe's largest economy, the right-wing populist party there, which now has a sort of neo-Nazi contingent within it, which counts for like 35% of all of its members, was literally spawned by the political reaction to the refugee crisis. That party started out as it was literally called the Professor's Party, and then eventually sort of attracted right-wing actors who took over the party and made it very specifically an anti-refugee party, which then did very well in the 2017 Bundestag elections. And so it sort of reshaped the political landscape in Germany. There has not been a party that has succeeded in entering the Bundestag, which is the German lower house, in the history of Germany up until the arrival of the AfD, which is the alternative for Germany. And although now I think they're the fourth largest party, prior to that they were the third largest party, and the fact that they've managed to persist despite the abating of the refugee crisis suggests that the political landscape of Germany has been, to some extent, permanently altered, in the sense that individuals who had these right-wing attitudes are now allowed to sort of say them out loud in a way that they were not in Germany before, for obvious reasons. Sweden has also, the Swedish Democrats recently did very well in the elections in Sweden, and it's for similar reasons. They've really capitalized on the reaction to the arrival of immigrants, which Sweden, like Germany, really sought to sort of take its part or do its part in managing the refugee crisis as a wealthy country that's sort of looking to lead from a values perspective. But that led to sort of massive backlash in what was a really quite a homogenous country prior to the arrival of these immigrants, or refugees rather. Yeah, so I think I've talked about most of these things, and one thing I'd like to highlight, however, is that there were real costs that came with managing the refugee crisis, and many of those costs were sort of borne by local governments that may already have been struggling, especially in Germany. And so while there's obviously a desire to sort of meet the moment ethically in these spaces, I think there were also real concerns among some German citizens about the literal cost of managing the crisis. And so the AfD is the only party that was really ready to sort of stand up and say, like, no, we have to sort of push back on this in a serious way, was able to capture a lot of those voters. And so some of the work that I do focuses on the sort of the character of AfD support and trying to dissect where these individuals come from. And one of the things that's really quite distinct about this party is that there's no one voter profile. There are actually several different kinds of voters who all cluster together under the AfD party banner. And so even though they don't have a lot of support, they're pulling from this sort of, they don't have a sort of overwhelming amount of support. They're still, garnering like 17% of the vote in the country. They're getting it from diverse places. So there are individuals who are sort of concerned about immigration, but not necessarily don't necessarily desire the sort of right-wing economic format that the AfD pushes. And so I think part of what's happening here, or part of what happened during the refugee crisis, was there was not a lot of space in mainstream governance for people who reacted to the refugee crisis negatively. And so some of these individuals got pushed to the right, got pushed to these populist parties, because it was a political space that the parties who supported the European Union weren't necessarily sort of excited to take on, or a political position they weren't excited to take on. But ultimately, the refugee crisis has faded. And so if you were to look at support for the AfD in 2021, you'd see that it had gone down. And you would also see that many of those sort of moderate voters who had voted for the party at the peak of the refugee crisis have left. And instead, they've been replaced by individuals who are concerned about COVID-19. And what's especially interesting about that is that the individuals who are choosing to vote for the AfD out of concern over COVID-19 are selecting into the party based on whether or not they were okay with the party's refugee rhetoric in the first place. And so they sort of cornered a market for themselves, which is still determined by the position that they took during the refugee crisis, but which is now also like very much determined by individuals' positions on COVID-19. So if you don't like the restrictions, if you wish life was normal, and you sort of don't care about public health, then you voted for the AfD. If you were also okay with sort of like the extreme restrictions that the AfD was pushing for, both in terms of who was allowed into the country, but also in terms of what the AfD wanted to do around integration. So the AfD was proposing standards of Germanness that would have to be met, and if you couldn't meet them, then you would be politely asked to leave the country. And so that would be, involve sort of like passing cultural tests and things like that. Some of this stuff very, very ominous. And so this is it's kind of comforting to see the support showing my political bias here, but it's comforting to see the support come down as the refugee crisis abates, seeing individuals leave the party. It's going to be interesting to see once the COVID crisis is over and the refugee crisis is over, whether a party like the AfD can continue to persist in Germany. Evidence from West Germany is that maybe it can't. East Germany, potentially a different story, and we're going to talk about why that might be. So the two things that I just talked about from my perspective are the elements that really build towards populism being a cultural reaction to crisis, right? There are certain things that happen which are challenging the traditional culture of Europe, both in terms of immigration, people arriving, but also just because the culture of Europe is changing under the European Union, in the sense that individuals are now allowed to move about as they please. Young people, at least in Western Europe, are far more likely to identify as European, and identifying as European, see themselves as somebody who might move to France instead of simply living in Germany and sort of contributing to the German state. But also the EU has been a mechanism of social reform throughout Eastern Europe and Central Europe as well. And this has meant not just during the European Union, but also during the application process for these countries. These were countries that had just come out from under the USSR and who wanted to get the benefits and protections that would come from being associated with the European Union, but which would also come with commitments to democracy. And this is sort of a question of whether or not the cultural commitment to democracy is something that can be sort of quickly manufactured in 20 years or 30 years, or whether it's something that sort of grows slowly over time. And you can see in Eastern Europe now, we have these parties that are emerging that are somewhat anti-democratic, sort of more in line with the sort of strongman mentality that we see in Russia today as well. And so I think there's a case to be made that cultural change is being sort of pushed in Eastern and Central Europe through things like the expansion of LGBTQ rights, which were sort of validated at the EU level and then sort of forced down onto very Christian, very conservative countries like Hungary and Poland, many of which outside of their sort of urban centers are largely opposed to those kinds of advancements. And so you have a cultural reaction, which is both a product of the long-term effects of the European Union, as it tries to draw together these countries that are all at different levels of development, which are all come from sort of pretty diverse cultural backgrounds, as well as the sort of like immediate sharp shock of the refugee crisis, which was felt very sort of abruptly by the countries of Eastern Europe, but which was also felt eventually by Germany and Sweden as they sought to take on the mantle of leadership in that context. And so then these are some of the quotes from populists all over Europe on culture. And what I think is really interesting about these quotes is not just what they specifically say, but what's implied in what they're saying, right? So there's this sort of, when someone says, I am not ashamed to say that our culture is far better than the Islamic culture, which is a culture of barbarism, not only are they sort of actively saying, like, I stand up against Islamic fundamentalism is probably sort of more specifically what he's talking about, although maybe I shouldn't give him that credit. He's also suggesting that somebody is trying to make him feel ashamed for saying that, right? And so there's this sort of, you can see that again with Giorgia Meloni, whose name I forgot earlier. I'm Georgia, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm an Italian, I'm Christian, you will not take that away from me. And so she's constructing this sort of position for herself in terms of her identity. She's making it very clear who she is. And at the same time, she's suggesting that there's somebody out there who's trying to take that away from her, which really is a very effective way of activating individuals who feel that their society is sort of changing around them in a way that they don't like. And whether that's a product of the European Union, whether that's a product of economic decline, whether that's a product of having a whole bunch of refugees moving into your neighborhood, that sense of otherness in your own space and anger over said otherness is something that populists are trying to tap into. And there are a number of populist scholars who focus on this idea that the specific discontent or this specific unhappiness that an individual feels is less important because the populist sort of stands up and says, I'm unhappy too. And so then anybody can read their own particular unhappiness into the populist. And they sort of feed off of those diverse problems that spring up in Europe. And so when you have multiple of them all happening at once, so like say you had a financial crisis followed by a refugee crisis in the midst of a rather significant political transformation, then you would have a lot of different discontents that a political entrepreneur could draw on by simply saying that the system is really failing and you're not happy with it. And in addition to that, we have this sort of real effect of cultural transformation, which is taking place as a function of some of the other things that we've already talked about. So there's Europeanization. There's a whole generation of individuals now who are have grown up under the European Union, and it's all they've ever known. So they don't have that reference of, oh, I wish it was like it was back in the good old days, because for them, the good old days are now, right? Like this is it. And you can see that in something like support for Brexit, where younger individuals were far more likely to say, I want to stay in the European Union. I want to be able to go to France whenever I want. I want to be able to do an internship in Germany and then come back. And I think this sort of points to the extent to which another part of what's happening here is simply the natural cultural change which comes as societies progress, right? I mean, there are sort of distinct cultural differences which exist across age groups as a function of the fact that you grow up in a particular environment, which is different from the environment that another person grew up in. Even if you grew up in the exact same place, if it was 50 years ago, it was a different place, right? And that has an effect. So there are these sort of diverse groups that are being spoken to, and one of the groups that's being spoken to here is this older group that is not only seeing the sort of the natural turn of that societal change, but one which is being sort of radically exacerbated by the political and economic transformations which are taking place, and also by some of these other shocks that have happened. And it's just simply the case that if you undertake transformative change, you're going to bump into problems, and then if the Middle East happens to be unsettled at the same time, it's just going to get that much worse. And so you can sort of see, actually, that the most stark differences are in Western Europe. Over here, these are, I think I may have lost the title to this chart, but it's how important are traditions and religion to you? So how important are the sort of traditional values of your community and religion? Yeah, sorry, no, I just lost it altogether. And you can see that in Eastern Europe, the difference between people who are over the age of 35 and people who are under the age of 35, over the age of 35 are these dark dots, and under the age of 35 are the lighter dots. The difference is not as dramatic in Central and Eastern Europe as it is in Western Europe, where it's really quite pronounced. And these are the areas where the economic transformation and the social transformation is strongest. And they're also the areas, I think, where the specific cultural emphasis of the right-wing populist parties is most pronounced. Because you have a cultural emphasis in Central and Eastern Europe, but they also have made radical changes to the social state in a way that sort of really augments it and protects individuals who are living in rural spaces. On the left here, you have how important is having been born in the country to being a true member of your country, right? So how important is being born in Denmark to being Danish? And we can see that there's a 16% point difference between individuals who are under 35 and older than 35 in relation to answering this question. So individuals who are older than 35 in Denmark are far more likely to say, it is very important to be born in Denmark if you want to be Danish than younger people are. And the same thing can be said about having a family background, although that is in fact, it's even more pronounced, right? So you can see that older individuals are just more likely to see national identity as being something that you're born into and not something that you can construct. And younger individuals are less likely to see it that way. And I think you would probably see similar things in the US as well. But I think it's really quite pronounced in Europe because of this European project that has been undertaken and the radical shift in the sort of the character of the younger individual's citizenship. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is the economic transformation that's underway. And this is a useful thing to talk about because we don't have a European Union here in the United States. We did that like 300 years ago. But we do have economic change, right? That's something that's very much happening in the US. And if you looked at a map of the US, you would see a similar sort of variegation in the sense that there are some spaces, these red spaces, that are depopulating. So these are spaces where the population is actually going down. I think generally when we think of countries, we think of their populations going up. And that's probably true for all of these countries. But the reality is that the concentration of individuals in these spaces is sort of wildly different depending on what region you're in. So if you're in East Germany, you'll see this is very dark red. These spaces are depopulating. Individuals are leaving. Primarily, these individuals are the sort of the educated, the able, the young. These are individuals who would be expected to drive the economy in these spaces forwards. And so it's becoming harder and harder for the individuals who remain in those spaces to continue to live well and to believe that their community is going to persist into the future. And in the United States, you would see, especially in the Midwest, but if through much of the United States, a pattern that looks like this, where rural spaces are depopulating and urban spaces are growing very, very rapidly. Maybe not in Florida because we're growing really, really fast, but certainly in some of the sort of the older, not necessarily older, but historically more developed parts of the country. So New York, this is happening. Michigan, it's certainly happening. There are counties in the Upper Peninsula of northern Michigan that lose something like 15% of their population every 10 years, which is, I mean, you probably can't maintain that kind of loss for very long, but it does have a profound impact on the health of the community and the prospects of the community. And for the individuals who have lived there for their entire lives, that's pretty damaging, right? Because you're sort of being left behind in that context. And for individuals who can't afford to live somewhere else, it's even worse because then you're really just stuck. But you'll see that in some spaces, the difference is more demarcated by a sort of stalling of growth. So here in France, in rural spaces, there aren't too many places that are actively shrinking, but there are some spaces that are, they're sort of stalling out. And that, I think, in terms of population growth, you would expect a place to grow, right? Because people are living there, they're having children. And so this means that the sort of the net migration rate in those spaces where you see the population stalling out is actually negative. And so if this was a pure sort of migration map, those places would be red. And the dynamic is actually most pronounced here in Poland, right? And so this is a country where populists have done incredibly well. And one of the reasons they've done well is because they've altered the social state in a way that protects the economic condition of the individuals who are living in rural spaces. So they're sort of recognizing they're living in a country that's being economically transformed, not just because it's a member of the European Union, but also because technology is changing and the entire world is being transformed. And so they're addressing the issue, and they're reaping the political dividends of addressing the issue. And so when it comes back to this conceptualization of populism being a political reaction to the representative failures of democracy, economic transformation is another form of permanent change, right? Once a company invests in a robotic workforce, there's not really much chance that they're going to say, okay, well, we'll throw these robots that we've spent millions of dollars on away and hire people to work for us again who are going to cost even more. The reality is that those jobs, that particular economic condition has sort of faded into the past, and it's not probably coming back, right? The political and economic cost of bringing it back would be akin to the political or economic cost of trying to leave the European Union, which is, as we can see with Brexit, exorbitant, right? You lose your financial industry, you lose the sort of economic opportunities for your young people, and you have a sort of really significant political destabilization at the same time. And it's sort of the same kind of thing. I mean, you think about other countries that have undergone efforts to radically restructure their economies. You can think about like China under Mao or Portugal. It generally doesn't go very well. There's an incredible cost that's associated with it because it's hard to run an economy. And so it's hard to move backwards. It's hard to sort of take on the structured state approach. And for all of those reasons, it becomes an increasingly untenable political position to hold that you're going to sort of make America the way it was in that respect, right? But what does that mean for the individuals who live in those spaces? Just because the factory closes down doesn't mean that the community ceases to exist, right? This is, I think, one of the sort of the tensions between society and the free market, in the sense that society moves at a slower pace than the market does. Capital can move from one space to another relatively quickly, but the individuals who lived in that space, they don't operate in the way they might in an economic simulation, right? They can't simply transport themselves immediately to this new space. And even if they could, because they certainly could get on a plane and go there, their families would still be living in those other spaces. And that is also a social cost, right? And that has implications as well. So humans are not these sort of perfect rational actors, in the sense that just because a place is no longer an economically tenable place to live doesn't mean that they're not going to want to continue to live there. And so that has an impact as well. And this, again, is a permanent change that government now has to find a solution to, right? What is the solution? You can offer subsidies, you can subsidize rural spaces, but that is an expensive way to solve the problem. And it's been shown that during economic shocks, spaces that are subsidized, that are sort of existing on transfers from richer spaces, do not recover in the same way, right? So the economic health of these spaces, if they are not sort of standing on their own 2 feet, will just continue to deteriorate, even if you try to sort of keep it alive through transfers. And this brings us back again to permanent change, right? I sort of like, this is something I increasingly think of populism as the politics of permanent change, in the idea that there are going to be things that happen that no government could effectively remediate and bring back to the way it was. And when that happens, democracy is sort of at a sort of struggle point, in the sense that you're now faced with an issue that a lot of people are going to prefer one outcome for, and that outcome is not achievable. And so there's no effective way for democracy to represent the interests of those people. The people who live in the upper peninsula of Michigan, unless somebody can find a way to make living there economically viable soon, it's not a reasonable thing to ask for a government official to fix the economic condition in that space, because it's going to be really hard to do. And it's the same kind of thing. We have this tension that exists between change, which is occurring in the world, and democracy, which promises to solve your problems, right? When candidates come to you and say, I'm going to solve a problem, you say, that's great, I'll vote for you. But what happens when your problems can't be solved, right? What then for democracy? And so I think this is sort of the state of populism in Europe today. It's being confronted with challenges which maybe are not impossible to solve. Some of them aren't, but they're certainly very, very challenging. And it's going to be up to the governments to come up with meaningful solutions to those problems in order to sort of stem support for populist parties. And I think, honestly, the European Union, with its sort of the sort of social state that's emphasized in the European Union, has sort of set itself up to mitigate the impact specifically of this effect, of the economic transformation more effectively than states that don't have that sort of cushion, right? Here in the United States, if you live in a rural space, you're getting some help from the government, but you're not getting the kind of help that's promised to Europeans who live in rural spaces. And of course, that comes with other expenses. Individuals have to pay a lot more tax over there. They've committed themselves to the European project, which comes with sort of effects on your national identity. So there are trade-offs no matter where you live. There are going to be positives and negatives. But this to me is the major challenge for populism today. The shocks of the refugee crisis and the Euro crisis are fading into the past. What will persist are the challenges of European identity and the European Union and the challenges of economic transformation. And the reality of economic transformation is also that it's getting faster, right? Technology is increasing and improving at a faster rate than it was 50 years ago. 50 years from now, it'll be even faster than it is right now. And so what does that mean for governments? Governments are going to have to learn how to live in a state of perpetual permanent change. And so that's the challenge at play, as I see it today, that they're facing. So the good news from the European perspective is many of these parties, the Euro crisis, the refugee crisis, and COVID-19 have been important in driving support for populists. So when they fade into the background, if Europe gets a moment of peace, which it hasn't had, it pretty much since it started back, since the European project really sort of formally took off, we may see that the populist moment in Europe subsides. But the structural challenges are still very much in play. And so it's going to be the extent to which those challenges can be addressed, I think, will determine whether we see populism sort of pass out of existence altogether. And that may just not happen because some of these challenges are really great, right? Like reconciling national and European identity, addressing the lag between economic change and where people actually live. Again, very hard to do, very costly. But who knows? Who knows what the sort of potential solutions are that are out there that people will find. And I think ultimately populism as a concept really highlights this challenge that democracy faces when it's presented with a problem that it can't solve. How do you sort of surmount that from the perspective of a government that's sort of trying to sort of promise that it will address the needs of the people? And I think, that's it. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. This was really revealing. I think he's told us some things that we really hadn't thought too much about. Any questions for Mike?
Mike, I'm curious as to how you feel the reaction to the British withdrawing from the EU and what is apparently a disaster there. Do you think that that's going to help the EU in the future because people see that?
Yeah. So I think it already has, in the sense that many of the Eurosceptic parties that said we're going to have a Frexit and a Polexit, and Polish and French exit, they've taken that off the table. It's no longer something that they would even consider because they can see the cost that comes with it. And so the European Union is the new reality. I think this may have been the nail in the coffin of pretending like the European Union is something that can be reversed. I think it's also a good thing because the UK has sort of been unique in the EU as a large state with a liberal market economy, sort of more in the American style. Of course, they have a bigger social state than the US does, but it's relative to some of these other countries not quite as big. And so from the perspective of the sort of economic policy diversity of Europe, the UK leaving has actually reduced that, which may actually make it easier for the countries that are there to integrate more effectively. And I think also, to your point about, sort of what is it going to do to the UK to countries that are in the EU. They're going to be watching the UK now exist as a relatively small country with a massive neighbor, and having to live with the political ramifications of that. And that's going to sort of ward off any other attempt for a sort of reduction in the connection between the states that are in the EU and the sort of the European Union institutions themselves. Because I think it's analogous to like, I don't know, if California decided that it wanted to become its own country, it's like, well, that's great. You're very big, California, but you're not like United States big, and now you live next to the United States. So you're a relatively like medium-sized country with a massive neighbor that's going to have to reconcile itself to that reality. Yeah.
Question here from Nick.
This is a very common thing, but we've experienced this in the U.S. where rural areas populations are declining and so on. One thing that's kind of I think is going to partially reverse that trend is the growth of the internet and how important that is and where we work and where we live. And at least in the United States, we're putting a lot of money and a lot of effort into getting better internet connections in sparsely populated areas. And I'm wondering, so certainly the Europeans see that also. So do you see some sort of emphasis on that, trying to improve internet connections in the rural areas and thereby perhaps slowing the decline of the rural areas?
Yeah. So the EU actually has a set of institutions which are structural development funds. And one of the things that they do is to try and improve internet connections. But they do a bunch of other stuff as well. There's one fund specifically, which is called the European Regional Development Fund. And it's actually focused on trying to develop those spaces economically and come up with creative solutions that would allow rural spaces to stand on their own two legs. And there's a good reason to want that to happen, not just because of the individuals who live in those spaces being able to sort of return to a reality where their economic prospects are on the way up, but also because we've seen in recent years, in the past, there's been a big emphasis on agglomeration, on living in cities and taking advantage of economies of scale. But in recent years, we've seen there's a diminishing returns to that dynamic. And eventually, innovation and growth, they continue in those large spaces, but they perhaps don't continue at the rate they might have if there had been 3 or 4 large spaces, right? So it's still good to have competition amongst the sort of the economic centers of a country. And so I think Europe is investing in their internet infrastructure, and I think they are very interested in sort of moving away from agglomeration and sort of a single mega city of the sort of like London, Paris type, not just because it'll help rural spaces, but also because it'll help the economy generally.
Mike, while I'm getting this other question, one of your early slides, you mentioned that one of the things that characterized the populist movement was support of the welfare state. And that didn't seem to click with me. Can you? Yeah.
So the European populists are generally different from U.S. populists. So obviously in the U.S. they're tied tightly to the Republican Party for the most part. And we have Bernie Sanders, but it's not, it's not right-wing populism, which is really what I've been focusing on here. But right-wing populism in Europe is sort of, I think, truly conservative. And what I mean by that is that it's not just about maintaining traditional values, but it's also about maintaining the sort of societal condition, right? So when you think about the Republican Party, they're about traditional values in the United States, but they're also about sort of letting the liberal market do the free market sort of fly. And when the free market flies, as we've seen, like communities get undercut. And so right-wing populist parties in Europe are conservative in the sense that not only do they want to maintain traditional values, but they also want to maintain communities in rural spaces. And one of the ways that they do that is through the welfare state. So if you think about like the Danish People's Party or the National Rally in France or Law and Justice in Poland, or the Fidesz in Hungary, right? In Hungary, the country with the most amount of maternal leave is, or in Europe, the country with the most amount of maternal leave is Hungary. And one of the reasons for that is they are trying to push a particular vision of society, right? So if you give women lots of time off to take care of their kids, maybe, they're sort of like focus on being moms instead of focus on being employed. And that sort of helps to perpetuate traditional gender roles. And so there's, I think that's the connection.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Not something very different from what we experience.
Yeah.
You had a question?
Oh, sure. Then a question. I have learned from my travels how one country solved the problem of refugees, and it was Slovakia. And Slovakia is not a big country, not a rich country. So when the refugees came to Slovakia, they gave them 50 euros a month each to live. Well, it turns out that Austria, which is right next to Slovakia, gives 500 euros per month. So it didn't take very much to figure out that it is much better to live in Austria than to live in than in Slovakia. So I guess, and really, most of these refugees, well, they're economic refugees, naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm a refugee. I came from Europe because life was better in the United States for me. So,
yeah, that's.
I can understand it, but I didn't just come here expecting to be supported. And I'm a little bit surprised. I cannot quite understand what is Mr. Orban's problem. Why is he a populist? Because if anything, certainly Hungary doesn't have problem with refugees. Because if anything, Hungarians are leaving Hungary in droves. And unless he would like to maintain whatever it is, purity, some kind of purity, because there are a lot of Romas in Hungary. And I don't know, I just don't understand it. It's not important.
No, it's definitely super important. And I think one of the things that's happening is that populists are political entrepreneurs in the sense that somebody like Viktor Orban sees the refugee crisis as an opportunity to sort of attack a really easy straw man, right? So he holds up the refugees as this major problem that's threatening, and it really is like a question of the purity of the Hungarian state. And he's spent a lot of time trying to foster this sort of this pseudo-fictional legacy of a historic Hungarian empire that sort of may have existed to some extent, but not to the extent that he plays it up. And it's all part of his effort to sort of gather up enough control to subvert democracy in Hungary, which he's done quite successfully. And now, he's a person that is going to be able to sort of, every time there's election, Viktor Orban wins, even if, not everybody would support him normally. So it's, yeah.
Any other questions? Well, Mike, this, as I said, this has really been revealing. I think I've always viewed the populist movements in Europe as something that would always be a fringe. There would always be a few people who were neo-Nazis, but when you look at the true cultural roots of populism, you can see that this is something that's going to be in Europe for a long time. And I think you've opened our eyes to that.
Thank you.
We thank you very much.